loves, today I'm going to be doing a September books video for you instead of today's vlog. If you have come here for the vlogs and you're confused, there will be a vlog tomorrow in which I'm hoping there's going to be footage from both Friday and Saturday, so you're not missing out on anything. This video is just enabling me not to edit today, which is Saturday, so I can spend some time with my friends. I thought I would do a little September books for you. I only read 6 books this month, and that is partially because I did spend a lot of time reading books that I ended up putting down and not liking, including Where My Heart Used to Beat by Sebastian Faulks, The Pagoda by Patricia Powell. Oh, I've just realised I am missing a book, so actually I read 7 books this month. What else did I put down? I put down All Swords. So it did enable me to get those books off my shelves, just not by reading them. So I've read far fewer books. I also managed to get myself kind of 700 pages into A Suitable Boy by Vikram Seth, but I haven't finished that, so that will come to you in the October books and probably during the vlogs a little bit as well. So before we begin, as always, let's discuss this month's book club book. I will hopefully read this in VLOGTOBER and talk to you guys a little bit about it, but I'm also planning on doing a dedicated October books video, which will come to you, I imagine, in the second week of November. I'm going to be having a little bit of a break in the first week of November, so yeah, second week of November, so you have got that long to read it if you do want to join in with the book club. As I say every month at the moment, I am struggling a little bit with the selection of books that I've currently got, quite a random selection, and I just don't feel like a lot of them are suitable for book club, but I picked this one. It's called Mother's Milk by Edward St Aubyn. It was shortlisted for the Man Booker in 2006. I'm just going to read the blurb instead of trying to work out what it's about, because to be fair, I don't actually know that much about this book, but I think someone recommended it to me the other day, or something like that. I read about it somewhere, so I'm intrigued by it and I want to read it. So the blurb says, the once illustrious, once wealthy Melroses are in peril. Caught up in the wreckage of broken promises, child-rearing, adultery and assisted suicide, Patrick finds his wife consumed by motherhood, his mother consumed by a New Age foundation, and his 5-year-old son Robert understanding far more than he ought. Mother's Milk is a dazzling exploration of the troubled allegiances between parents and children, husbands and wives. Acerically witty, disarmingly tender, it goes to the core of a family trapped in the remains of its ever-present past. So if you like family dramas, I think this one is going to be for you. Don't know about the content, so please be warned. I don't know if there's any kind of deeply upsetting content in here. So that is October's book club pick. And last month was The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, which you may actually have seen me finish on the first day of October, so it's a slight cheat. This is by Arundhati Roy, who wrote The God of Small Things, which I know that many of you love because you've recommended it to me many times over the years. I actually read it during my gap year, so that's about 7 years ago now. So it's a long time ago. So I have read that one and I remember really enjoying it, but I don't remember much about it. Now this book has not been as widely acclaimed and lots of people don't actually like this book very much. However, I was really pleasantly surprised by it. I don't know if pleasantly is quite the word, because the content of this novel is extremely heavy. Lots of people were just saying they didn't enjoy it as much as The God of Small Things, or they didn't think it was as good in various different ways, but I actually really liked it and found it to be a very informative, very fulfilling read. So this is a book about a small cast of characters that live on the fringes of society, and it's about the way they perceive the turmoil and political events that happen in India from the outside, as obviously the literary term would be the other, but Roy is obviously placing them in the centre of this narrative, and I found that the portrayal of those characters is really full of love and empathy and understanding, and really fleshes them out in a very believable and kind of beautiful way, and I think Roy really took a lot of care there, and I appreciate that a lot. She's not kind of using them for her own kind of literary clout or anything. She clearly has like a strong feeling towards people that are pushed to the outside of society, and you can really feel that in this book. And I wrote multiple times in my notes that this book was kind of seething with anger towards various political problems in India, but also with empathy and with love and with understanding, which I thought was really beautiful. Yeah, I can't really compare it directly to God of Small Things because, as I said, I did read it a long time ago, so I can't really compare writing styles, but it does feel familiar. Roy has a very rich way of writing. So the first half kind of focuses on a hijra, or a transgender woman. Those two terms aren't exactly equatable. The second half of the book focuses on a young woman who is part untouchable, and particularly in the second half of the book, she's much more involved in politics in Kashmir, and there's a lot more, how to describe it, there's a little bit less storyline and a little bit more kind of politics, and I said it's almost like multimedia. You get a little bit of kind of media stories here and there, you get someone's manifesto, that sort of thing. So there's lots of kind of bits inserted into the narrative, which I think is possibly where some people get a bit alienated from this book, but I personally didn't mind it, and I thought it kind of added to it. Once you're kind of 100 to 200 pages into that, it did feel a little bit like I would quite like to get back to the storyline, but it didn't bother me too much, really. The one thing I really didn't think worked about this book was the first few pages. I just didn't know what was going on. To be fair, I was slightly distracted when I was reading them, but don't let them put you off if you read them and you're like, what is happening here? The book really gets into a much better flow and a better rhythm, but yeah, the first few pages didn't really work for me. It was kind of slightly, it felt just, the writing felt slightly forced, and I wasn't sure about them. Ultimately, my conclusion was this is an important book, an important contemporary piece of Indian literature, and it really, if you are interested in the politics of the time or the area, it's well worth reading, because I think it introduced me to lots of things that I actually didn't know about. I know a fair amount about kind of partition and the end of colonial rule and stuff, but I didn't know quite so much about this time. My own fault, of course. It's very informative in lots of ways. Yeah, and I just said there was lots to unpack. There's tiny details in this. I'm sure you could spend hours analysing this. There's so much here, and it's well worth a read. I thought it was really great, and I hope that you guys enjoyed it as well. Yeah, so I think it was a good one for this month. Okay, it feels like I read this book absolutely ages ago. This is Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders. It was the winner of the Man Booker in 2017. I wrote absolutely loads of notes on this, and I'm just trying to re-familiarise myself with them. So one of Lincoln's young sons, Willie Lincoln, he died aged 11 whilst this American Civil War was happening. Basically, George Saunders imagines a world, a kind of limbo or bardo, in which Willie Lincoln finds himself surrounded by other dead people who are also unwilling, for whatever reason, to pass on into proper death. So they're lingering in the graveyard in a ghostly fashion. And the structure of this book is pretty unique. It's sort of like a script or a screenplay. So when you open up the book, you'll see little paragraphs, or sometimes it does go on for a page or two, and then you'll see a name underneath, and that's what someone has said. So I feel like if I'd known that, it would have made the first few pages of this book easier to read, because I had no idea what was going on for a second there. So yes, it's supposed to read almost like a script. And then on top of that, it's also interspersed with, I'm not actually sure, I didn't do the research, probably should have done. I assume is quotes from historical pieces, you know, interviews with Lincoln's servants, or historians writing about the period of time and Willie Lincoln's death. So there's a few chapters which just have those kind of historical parts as well, not just what's happening in the graveyard itself. Lots of people like this book because it's unusual. It obviously won the Man Booker, and lots of people don't like this book because they find it slightly too pretentious and a bit too experimental. I have to say, I was so pleasantly surprised by this book. I thought I was going to go into it and just think this is too heavy, I don't know what's going on. Like, I just thought it would be a Last Samurai situation for me. However, I really enjoyed it. I thought it was super readable. I thought it was really moving and touching. Yeah, I thought it brought history to life, and it's also got funny moments, light moments. And yeah, the script-like style, I said, feels immediate and arresting. It really places you in amongst all these characters, and you feel each of the individual personalities, and you feel as if they're talking to you. and obviously he creates great characters for the surrounding cast in the graveyard, as well as it being historically interesting because I don't really know much about that period of time, and because you're kind of constantly immersed in their world, it feels very active and like there's lots happening, and it doesn't feel too bogged down, even in the historical sections really, because again you get that kind of chorus effect. There's definitely something interesting going on with the time frame, like the speaking time frame of each of the characters and also the kind of overarching time frame, but that's for an essay, that's not for this video. It's also about the process of compiling a historical novel, I think. But mostly it is about grief and loss and the difficulty of letting go of people that you love. And yeah, apparently Saunders based his story around the idea that after his son had died, Abraham Lincoln visited the graveyard and actually kind of held his body whilst in the graveyard, which is a really unusual thing to do, of course. So Saunders kind of was inspired by that moment or that idea and built the novel around that. He typically writes short stories, I think, but I thought this really worked. I thought he was clearly a good master of the novel, and I will definitely be keeping an eye on him, and I will also be reading some of his short stories, I think, in the future, because yeah, I really enjoyed this. Yeah, I said it's not painstaking, like compared to other historical novels, for example, it's not painstakingly slow or boring or bogged down by research or flowery language, like other experimental or pretentious novels. It felt alive, it felt vibrant, and it felt like it kept me interested, I guess. And yeah, so yeah, anyway, as I was saying, it's really a novel about grief and loss, and it's very moving, and I think a lot of people could relate to it, which I think is quite an interesting thing to do with a historical novel about a character as famous as Abraham Lincoln. So yes, a big thumbs up for this one for me, and I really wasn't expecting to like it, so that's good. Next we have Other Minds by Peter Godfrey-Smith. This is a non-fiction book about the octopus and the evolution of intelligent life. So the theory goes an octopus is the most intelligent invertebrate. So obviously there's lots of intelligent vertebrates out there, ourselves, although how intelligent are we really? And you know, elephants, dolphins, all of that sort of thing. But octopi are, as Godfrey-Smith says, kind of the closest we're going to get to understanding like alien intelligence, like a completely different kind of intelligence. And he uses ideas such as the octopus has a much more even spread of neurons throughout its body, and its arms have quite a lot of neurons in, so it's almost as if it's thinking with its arms as well as its brain, and how centralized is its intelligence and that sort of thing. So I thought all of that was very, very interesting. However, because this is a piece of popular science, it was never going to completely satisfy me. I read, as a part of my masters, lots and lots of stuff about animal intelligence, non-human intelligence. You know, I read all sorts about the way knowledge arises and all of that kind of stuff. So for me, this was slightly on the simplistic side in certain assumptions that Godfrey-Smith makes about humans, intelligence, and all the rest of it. So I kind of enjoyed the actual science parts of it, just hearing about how octopi neurons work, for example, or how they change colour. Like, I thought that was interesting. But when Godfrey-Smith started philosophizing about stuff, I just thought, I don't necessarily agree, or this or that, and I thought some of it was glossed over a little bit. Like, you could write a much longer book about that, I think. So yeah, as I said at the end of my notes, interestingly enough, I wished it was more octopus and less human. I'm sorry for the light, by the way, you guys. Suddenly the sun's decided to come out and go down. It's still valuable, and it's still good, and it's a good read, and I would recommend it to people. But yes, as a piece of academic literature, it's probably not quite tight enough on some of its ideas. If it sounds like it would interest you though, I think I would recommend giving it a read, because it is really readable, and it doesn't take too long. It's not a super long book. Okay, my loves, next up, a little bit of a weird one. This is City of Saints and Madmen by Jeff VanderMeer. This is about a city called Ambergris in kind of fictional world, certainly speculative fiction, and it's kind of 4 novellas and a little bit of kind of extra material about this world, almost presented as like a folder of documents basically to the reader to learn about ambergris. I can't remember what VanderMeer writes about his own writing. So VanderMeer calls his writing, or classifies his writing, under the new weird genre. But yeah, the stories are really rich, they're very unusual and interesting, they're quite funny, and they're steeped in kind of irony. I don't think irony is quite the right word, but they're self-reflexive, so it's quite postmodern. It's absurd but satisfying, fully realised, and each element is not gimmicky. So he imagines this kind of crazy world where there's like a selection of mushroom people who keep massacring everyone in the city at night time, or you know, the main food is freshwater squid and there's a festival of the squid, and all this kind of slightly absurd stuff that actually ends up having quite a serious selection of meanings. And I said you never quite know what's an insignificant detail or what's important, you know, what's like a silly throwaway thing that's clearly in there to be funny or weird or absurd, and what's actually quite significant to the whole theory of everything, and what you kind of should pick up on so you can relate it to something in a later novella or whatever. Yeah, there's definitely horror elements. It's also about authors and authoring. There's constant changes in tone, genre, style, to surprise and delight and elevate. Yeah, and then I said at the end, yeah, it's about capitalism, authoring, desire, art, violence, cities, juxtaposition and shifts, and the kind of gaps between what's said and what's not said become really important. So yeah, it's kind of an interesting book, but yeah, it's like laid out all crazy. Some of the sections are in different fonts, different formats, different styles. Some are like, one's a bibliography, like there's a whole long bibliography which has some little delights in it. One's a story written by a character in the book. One's a novella about a man named Jeff VanderMeer who is in an insane asylum in ambergris because he thinks he's making up ambergris in his head, and really he's in an asylum in Chicago. You know, there's a lot going on, and I have to say it reminded me most of Alistair Gray. If you've ever read any Alistair Gray, Scottish novelist, you'll be very familiar with this. And I don't think he's ever been tied to the new weird genre. I could be wrong. I did try and look it up, I think, at the time. I could definitely be wrong, but they have a very similar approach. I enjoyed it a lot. I will read his other stuff, definitely. I know that this is definitely not his most famous book. He's done a trilogy or something, I think, that starts with the book Annihilation. Yeah, Southern Reach trilogy, Annihilation, Authority and Acceptance. So they're definitely on my list. So let's have a look. So next we've got In the Skin of a Lion by Michael Ondaatje, and I actually started reading this from one of my uni classes, never ended up finishing it, but knew I kind of wanted to, so I decided to reread it basically. I'd not read his more famous novel, The English Patient. I think I read another Ondaatje though recently, his most recent one. God, I can't remember what it's called, Warlight. This is apparently, I think, almost a prequel-ish to The English Patient, because it features some of the characters that turn up in The English Patient. It's about a young man who goes to Toronto in the 1920s, ends up working and living there. And Ondaatje in this book, and I imagine in English Patient as well, has a very specific writing style which is very atmospheric. I said it was thickly coated / muffled with snow. It really feels like it has an impact that's sort of muffled by this quiet, unassuming language. Whirling and dreamlike, I said as well. Said that the unfinished nature of one of the characters, she's described as having an unfinished nature, is intoxicating, and it's also true of the book as a whole. It's hypnotic, it speaks to sadness and yearning for fulfillment as Patrick kind of explores Toronto and its world. It kind of is made up of sort of like short unfinished stories. There is a through line, and it does have quite a satisfying ending. Wow, the light's really coming out to mess with me. So yeah, I said it was like a river pulling you in, and I didn't stop to understand it all or analyse it as I would have done for uni. I actually found that, I don't know what I was reading when I was reading it for uni, but I found it to be a very different book having read it the second time round. I definitely didn't fully get it, I think, the first time I read it, but this time I really did. Yeah, so there's not loads and loads of plot, but it's an interesting book, and it's a book that has something to say. It's about the immigrants who don't get written into history. And then I wrote down a quote from Wikipedia actually when I was writing my little conclusion notes. It's about the wearing and the removal of masks, the shedding of skin, the transformations and translations of identity. So yeah, it's about a selection of immigrant characters working in Toronto and kind of what they contributed to history, but how they were written out of history. And yeah, I found it to be a really satisfying read, satisfying ending, interesting ideas, and rather beautiful language as well, and not too long of a read again. So I would recommend this one. We've got Robinson Crusoe, which I forgot to bring down, by Daniel Defoe. I mean, I felt like I needed to read this book because it kind of claimed to be the first novel almost, isn't it? And I was like, look, I love novels, I live my life by novels. And I never read it at uni. I clearly bought the book for uni and never read it. It's about a man that gets shipwrecked on an island. It's the classic story, but because it is so old, it wasn't a highly enjoyable read for me. You know, it's interesting in the sense of what it was and kind of how novels started as this kind of fake realism, because Defoe wrote it with all the kind of cover plate and everything saying it was written by Robinson Crusoe and that it was a real account. And obviously it was all entirely fictionalised. So that's quite an interesting way for the novel form to really take off. But yes, as a book in itself, it's not massively interesting. But I feel like you can't really compare books now to something like this. Obviously it's got some heavy racism and stuff in it as well, which if you want to avoid that in life, then definitely avoid this book. I thought there were some good books there, you guys. Would definitely recommend Ministry of Utmost Happiness, Lincoln in the Bardo, and City of Saints and Madmen. Those are my favourites. In the Skin of a Lion was also pretty good, but probably not as good as the other ones for me. Those ones really stood out. But yes, thank you so much for watching today, you guys. Hope that you enjoyed this video. Sorry about the sunlight. I mean, I would move and everything, but it just, I was on a roll there. Sometimes I've got to keep my brain going when I'm doing these sorts of videos. Thank you so much for watching, you guys, and I will see you again very soon. Bye!